In 1989, the Soviet Union was a superpower. It had the largest army in the world, nuclear weapons pointed at every continent, and 290 million people stretching across 11 time zones. 2 years later, it was gone. Not defeated in a war, not destroyed by an invasion. It just collapsed. One morning, the red flag came down over the Kremlin, and a country that had terrified the world for 70 years simply stopped existing. So how does the second most powerful nation on Earth fall apart in 24 months? And why did almost nobody see it coming? To understand that, we have to go back to a country that was already rotting from the inside long before anyone admitted it. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union looked unbeatable from the outside. Tanks rolled through Red Square every year. Cosmonauts orbited the Earth. The KGB watched everyone, everywhere. But behind the parades, the country was running on fumes. Grocery store shelves were empty. People stood in line for hours to buy a single loaf of bread. Toilet paper was a luxury item. Meanwhile, in factories across the country, workers had a saying. They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work. The economy was built on a system called central planning, where bureaucrats in Moscow decided exactly how many shoes, nails, and tractors every factory should produce. On paper, it looked organized. In practice, it was a disaster. A factory in Siberia might receive an order for 10,000 left shoes and 0 right ones because the planners measured success by total units produced, not by whether anyone could actually wear them. Comrade, the quota is met. We made 10,000 shoes this month. Where are the matching pairs? They didn't ask for matching pairs. They asked for 10,000 shoes, so nobody can wear them. That is a customer problem, not a factory problem. The minister will be furious. The minister will see the numbers and give us a medal. People are walking barefoot. People should be grateful we made shoes at all. That conversation was happening in some form across the entire country. And meanwhile, oil money, the one thing keeping the lights on, was about to vanish. Because in 1985, two things happened at the same time, and together they would rip the foundations out from under the entire Soviet system. The first thing that happened in 1985 was oil. Saudi Arabia, working quietly with the United States, decided to flood the world market with cheap crude. Prices crashed from around $30 a barrel to under 10. For most countries, that was inconvenient. For the Soviet Union, it was a death sentence. Oil and gas exports were paying for everything. Food imports, military spending, the whole machine. Overnight, 2/3 of that money vanished. The Kremlin's bank account went from comfortable to empty in months, and nobody had a backup plan. The second thing that happened in 1985 was a man named Mikhail Gorbachev. He was 54, the youngest leader the Soviet Union had seen in decades. And unlike the old men who came before him, he actually understood that the country was dying. His three predecessors had all literally died in office within a few years of each other. The joke in Moscow was that you needed a season ticket for state funerals. Gorbachev looked at the books and basically had a panic attack. He launched two reforms that he believed would save communism. Glasnost, meaning openness, and Perestroika, meaning restructuring. The idea was simple. Let people talk about problems honestly and let the economy breathe a little. What could go wrong? Mikhail, are you sure about letting newspapers print whatever they want? They will print the truth. That is the problem. The truth is that we are broke, our factories make garbage, and Chernobyl just exploded. So we let them say it. If we don't say it, they will say it anyway, just quieter. And then nothing changes. At least this way something might change. Something might change in the wrong direction. Anatoly, everything is already in the wrong direction. Gorbachev genuinely thought he could reform the Soviet system without breaking it. He was wrong, but not in the way anyone expected. The problem was that once people were allowed to ask questions, they couldn't stop. Why are the shelves empty? Why did our soldiers die in Afghanistan? Why does the Communist Party live in mansions while we share apartments? Why did nobody tell us the truth about Stalin? Each answer led to 10 more questions, and the more the government tried to explain, the worse it looked. And then, in April 1986, a nuclear reactor in northern Ukraine exploded, and the lie machine that had kept the Soviet Union running for 70 years finally broke in public. At 1:23 in the morning on April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant blew its roof off. A column of radioactive fire shot into the night sky over Ukraine, sending fallout drifting across Europe. It was the worst nuclear accident in history. And the Soviet government's first instinct was to pretend it hadn't happened. For 2 full days, Moscow said nothing. Not to its own people, not to the world. In the nearby city of Pripyat, families went about their weekend. Kids played outside in the radioactive dust. A wedding happened. People sunbathed on rooftops while invisible poison settled on their skin. The first the world heard about it was when alarms went off at a nuclear plant in Sweden, more than 1,000 kilometers away. Swedish workers thought their own reactor was leaking. Then they checked the wind, traced it back, and realized the radiation was coming from the Soviet Union. Comrades, Sweden is asking what happened. Tell them nothing happened. Their instruments say something happened. Their instruments are wrong. The radiation is in Poland now. Then Polish instruments are wrong too. Mikhail Gorbachev, every instrument in Europe cannot be wrong. Fine. Tell them there was a small fire. We have it under control. Do we have it under control? Absolutely not. But tell them we do. The cover-up made everything worse. By the time the Soviets admitted what had happened, hundreds of thousands of people had been exposed who shouldn't have been. Firefighters who had been sent in without protective gear were dying horribly in Moscow hospitals. Entire villages had to be evacuated and bulldozed. The final cleanup cost an estimated 18 billion rubles, which the country absolutely did not have. But the real damage wasn't the radiation. It was the trust. For 70 years, the Soviet government had told its citizens that the system worked, that the West was lying, that the party knew best. Chernobyl was the moment when ordinary people, including loyal communists who had believed every word, suddenly understood that their leaders would let them die rather than admit a mistake. Gorbachev later said Chernobyl was the real reason the Soviet Union collapsed. Not the economy, not the Cold War. The simple fact that nobody could believe anything the government said anymore. And once that was gone, a much bigger problem started bubbling up from the edges of the empire. The republics were starting to ask why they were even part of this country at all. The Soviet Union wasn't really one country. It was 15 republics stitched together by force, each with its own language, history, and grudges. On the maps in Moscow, they looked like happy members of one big family. On the ground, most of them had been conquered, annexed, or absorbed against their will, and they remembered. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, had been independent countries before Stalin grabbed them in 1940 under a secret deal with Nazi Germany. For decades, Soviet schoolbooks insisted those republics had voluntarily joined the Union. Everyone knew it was a lie, but nobody was allowed to say it out loud. Then Glasnost happened, and suddenly everybody was saying it. On August 23, 1989, exactly 50 years after that secret Nazi-Soviet pact was signed, something remarkable happened. Around 2 million people across the 3 Baltic states walked outside, held hands, and formed a human chain stretching 675 kilometers from Tallinn in Estonia, through Riga in Latvia, all the way to Vilnius in Lithuania. They stood there in silence, then started singing folk songs in languages Moscow had spent decades trying to suppress. Comrade, the Estonians are holding hands. Let them. The Latvians are holding hands too, so they are holding hands with the Estonians. The chain reaches Lithuania. How long is the chain? 675 kilometers. That is not a protest. That is a country saying goodbye. The Kremlin had no idea what to do. They couldn't shoot 2 million people for holding hands. They couldn't arrest them all. And under the new rules of Glasnost, they couldn't even pretend it hadn't happened, because foreign cameras were everywhere. Within a year, all 3 Baltic republics had declared themselves independent. Moscow refused to recognize it, but the message was out. You could leave. The empire was not eternal, and the Baltics were just the start. In the south, Armenians and Azerbaijanis began fighting each other over a small region called Nagorno-Karabakh. In Georgia, Soviet troops attacked a peaceful protest in Tbilisi in April 1989, killing 20 people with shovels and tear gas. In Central Asia, riots broke out over jobs, language, and ethnic resentment. The pattern was always the same. As soon as people realized Moscow wasn't going to crack down like in the old days, every old grievance came roaring back. And then, in the fall of 1989, something happened in Berlin that changed everything. For 28 years, the Berlin Wall had been the symbol of the Cold War, a concrete barrier slicing one city in half, guarded by soldiers with orders to shoot anyone who tried to cross. East Berliners who attempted to climb it were gunned down in the death strip. The wall wasn't just a wall. It was the line between two worlds, and the Soviet Union had spent billions making sure it stayed exactly where it was. Then, in the summer of 1989, the dominoes started falling. Hungary, a Soviet ally, quietly cut the barbed wire along its border with Austria. East Germans on vacation suddenly realized they could drive to Hungary, walk into Austria, and never come back. Tens of thousands did exactly that. The East German government begged Moscow to do something. Gorbachev's answer stunned them. He said no. Mikhail, the Hungarians are letting our citizens escape. Yes, you have to make them stop. No, we have tanks. We have tanks. Eric, your people don't want to live in your country anymore. That is not my problem to fix. It is yours, so you will not help us. I will not invade Hungary to keep Germans in Germany. That is madness. That is the future. Gorbachev had quietly told Eastern European leaders he would no longer use Soviet tanks to keep them in power. For 40 years, that threat had been the only thing holding their governments together. Without it, the dominoes fell in months. Poland held free elections in June. Hungary opened its borders in September. Czechoslovakia and Bulgaria changed governments in November. And on the night of November 9, 1989, a confused East German official held a televised press conference about new travel rules. A reporter asked when the rules took effect. The official shuffled his papers, found nothing, and improvised. He said, as far as I know, immediately. He had no idea what he'd just done. Within hours, tens of thousands of East Berliners were crowding the checkpoints, demanding to cross. The border guards had no orders. Nobody had told them what to do. After a few terrified phone calls to superiors who also had no orders, one commander just shrugged and opened the gate. People poured through. Strangers hugged on the streets. Someone brought a hammer, then another, then thousands. By morning, ordinary Germans were standing on top of the Berlin Wall, smashing chunks off it with whatever tools they could find, and the Soviet army was watching from the barracks, doing absolutely nothing. If the Soviet army wouldn't save East Germany, it wouldn't save anyone. That message hit Eastern Europe like a lightning bolt. By Christmas 1989, every communist government in the region was either gone or about to be. In Romania, the dictator Nicolae Ceausescu tried to give a speech from his balcony to a crowd of supporters. The crowd booed him. His face on live television went from confusion to fear to terror in real time. 3 days later, he and his wife were arrested, put through a quick trial, and executed by firing squad on Christmas Day. The whole Soviet bloc, the buffer zone Stalin had built after World War II, disappeared in about 6 months. And now millions of ordinary Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians watched this on television and asked the obvious question. If the Poles can throw off communism, why can't we? Inside the Soviet Union, things were getting genuinely desperate. The economy wasn't just struggling, it was collapsing. Inflation was running wild. Store shelves were emptier than they'd been in living memory. Cigarettes, soap, and sugar all required ration cards. Workers stopped getting paid on time. In some factories, they got paid in the products they made, so a light bulb factory worker would go home with a sack of light bulbs and try to trade them for bread. Petya, what did they pay you this month? 300 light bulbs. 300. What am I supposed to do with 300 light bulbs? Sell them. To who? Everyone already has light bulbs. The factory across the road got paid in toilet paper. Trade with them. He already tried. They want light bulbs. He has light bulbs. He has too many light bulbs. So do you. I know. That is the problem. Into this mess walked a man who would become Gorbachev's nemesis, Boris Yeltsin. A big, loud, hard-drinking Siberian who had been kicked out of the top leadership for being too pushy about reform. Instead of disappearing quietly, Yeltsin reinvented himself as a populist. He rode public buses to work to show solidarity with ordinary people. He gave interviews complaining about communist privilege. The party hated him. The public loved him. In 1990, Yeltsin did something nobody had ever dared. He resigned from the Communist Party live on stage during a televised congress. Then in 1991, he ran for president of the Russian Republic, the largest piece of the Soviet Union, and won in a landslide. Now there were two presidents in Moscow, and only one country. By the summer of 1991, the old guard had seen enough. The KGB chief, the defense minister, the prime minister, and a handful of other senior hardliners decided Gorbachev had to go. He was about to sign a new treaty that would loosen Moscow's grip on the republics even further, turning the Soviet Union into a loose federation. To them, that wasn't reform. It was surrender. So they decided to do what Soviet leaders had always done when things got out of hand: take over by force. On August 18, Gorbachev was vacationing with his family at a presidential dacha on the Black Sea coast in Crimea. A delegation showed up at his door, demanded he hand over power, and when he refused, they cut his phone lines and placed him under house arrest. The next morning, Soviet citizens turned on their televisions and saw ballet. Not news, not Gorbachev, just Swan Lake on a loop. In Soviet history, when state TV played ballet, it meant the leader was dead or in trouble. Everybody knew. Then the announcement came. A committee of 8 men declared a state of emergency. Gorbachev was sick, they said, and they were now in charge. Tanks rolled into Moscow. Troops took up positions around government buildings. The 1968 playbook for crushing the Prague Spring was being run again, this time on the Soviet capital itself. But something had changed. The hardliners had assumed people would just accept it, the way Soviets always had. Instead, thousands of Muscovites poured into the streets and surrounded the Russian parliament building known as the White House, where Boris Yeltsin had set up resistance headquarters. "Comrade Yeltsin, you should leave. They will arrest you. Then they will arrest me in front of the cameras. Sir, the tanks are coming." "Good. Bring me a megaphone. What are you going to do? Climb on one." In one of the most famous moments in modern history, Yeltsin walked out of the White House, climbed onto the turret of a Soviet tank, and gave a defiant speech to the crowd. He called the coup illegal and demanded soldiers refuse orders to attack civilians. Cameras captured it from every angle. The image went around the world in hours. A big Russian bear of a man standing on a tank, telling the most powerful security state on Earth no. And then the tank commander did something nobody expected. He saluted Yeltsin. The coup fell apart in 72 hours. The plotters had assumed the army would obey orders without question. It didn't. Soldiers around Moscow refused to fire on civilians. Tank crews started turning their gun barrels away from the White House as a signal they wouldn't attack. 3 young protesters were killed in scuffles with armored vehicles, but the massacre the plotters needed never happened. By August 21, the committee members were either under arrest or trying to flee. One shot himself. Another tried to and survived. The most powerful coup attempt in modern history collapsed because the conspirators were drunk, disorganized, and shocked that nobody wanted to help them. Gorbachev was freed and flown back to Moscow, but he came back to a country that no longer recognized him. While he'd been locked up in Crimea, Yeltsin had become the hero of the resistance. Crowds didn't chant for Gorbachev. They chanted for Yeltsin, and Yeltsin knew exactly what to do with that power. In a now legendary moment, Gorbachev returned to the Russian parliament to thank Yeltsin and the deputies for saving him. Yeltsin let him talk, then walked up to the podium and slid a piece of paper across to him. "Read this," he said. On live television, Gorbachev was forced to sign a decree suspending the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the same party he was still officially the leader of. It was a public execution of his own authority, broadcast to the entire country. "Mikhail Sergeyevich, please, just sign it. I have not even read it. Then read it on camera. This is humiliating. This is the new arrangement. You said we would govern together. We are governing together. I am telling you what to sign, and you are signing it." After the coup, the dam broke completely. One by one, the republics declared independence. Estonia and Latvia formalized what they'd already announced. Ukraine, the second largest republic, voted overwhelmingly for independence on December 1. Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, the Central Asian republics, all of them. Within 4 months of the coup, the Soviet Union had basically dissolved itself piece by piece. with each republic raising its own flag and printing its own laws. Gorbachev was now president of a country that didn't exist anymore. And on December 8, three men met in a forest hunting lodge in Belarus to make the divorce official, without telling him. The hunting lodge was called Belavia, deep in a forest on the Belarusian side of the Polish border. Three men arrived in private cars. Boris Yeltsin, president of Russia; Leonid Kravchuk, president of Ukraine; Stanislav Shushkevich, leader of Belarus. They were the heads of the three Slavic republics that had founded the Soviet Union back in 1922. Now they were going to end it. They drank, ate, talked through the night, and drafted a short document. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, it said, as a subject of international law and a geopolitical reality, ceases to exist. 3 signatures. That was it. A country of 290 million people, 2 superpowers worth of nuclear weapons, and 70 years of history, dissolved on a few sheets of paper in a forest cabin. Boris, are you sure about this? Gorbachev is still president. President of what? Of the Soviet Union. There is no Soviet Union. There is once we sign this. He will say we are committing treason. Let him. He has no army that will arrest us. The KGB. Half the KGB voted for me. So we just do this. We just do this. And then we call him. Call the Americans first. That last part was real. Yeltsin's first phone call after signing the agreement was to President George H.W. Bush in Washington, telling him the Soviet Union was finished. His second call was to Gorbachev, telling him the same thing. The Soviet president had found out from a foreign government before he heard it from his own people. Gorbachev exploded. He called the meeting illegal. He called it a coup. He called Yeltsin every name in the book. But he had no power left to stop it. The army wouldn't move for him. The party had been dissolved. The republics had already gone their own way. He was a president with no country, an emperor with no empire. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev appeared on television one last time. In a quiet, dignified speech, he announced his resignation. He said he had tried to reform the system and failed. He thanked the people. He said he believed in the future. Then he signed a document, handing the nuclear launch codes over to Yeltsin, and walked out. At 7:32 that evening, the red Soviet flag with its hammer and sickle was lowered from the dome of the Kremlin for the last time. The Russian tricolor went up in its place. There was no ceremony, no crowd, no soldiers saluting. Just a man on a roof doing his job. The morning after the flag came down, 290 million people woke up in 15 different countries. Borders that had been internal lines on a map suddenly became international frontiers. Families were split between nations. Soldiers stationed in foreign republics had to figure out which army they now belonged to. Russian engineers in Kazakhstan, Ukrainian factory workers in Estonia, Armenian doctors in Latvia, all of them had to decide who they were now. The 1990s in Russia were brutal. The shift from a controlled economy to capitalism overnight created chaos nobody was ready for. State factories were sold off for pennies to insiders who became overnight billionaires while pensioners ate cabbage soup. Life expectancy for Russian men dropped by 7 years. Alcoholism exploded. Organized crime ran whole cities. Yeltsin, the hero on the tank, ended his presidency drunk, sick, and deeply unpopular before resigning on New Year's Eve 1999 and handing power to a quiet former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin. The other republics had their own stories. The Baltic states joined NATO and the European Union and never looked back. Central Asian republics became dictatorships under the same Communist Party bosses who had run them before, just with new flags. Ukraine wobbled between Europe and Russia for decades, a tension that would explode in conflict years later. Belarus stayed frozen in time under a single ruler. The Caucasus turned into a patchwork of frozen wars over disputed territories that still aren't resolved today. And Gorbachev, the man who tried to save communism and accidentally ended, it lived for another 31 years. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. He became a respected elder statesman in the West. In Russia, he was hated by millions who blamed him for losing the empire. He once ran for president and got less than 1% of the vote. He died in 2022, watching his country invade Ukraine, the war he had spent his entire career trying to make impossible. The Soviet Union didn't fall because of one thing. It fell because of everything. a broken economy, a credibility crisis after Chernobyl, leaders who couldn't agree on what to fix first, a population that stopped believing the lies, and republics that finally saw a chance to leave. 70 years of one of the most ambitious experiments in human history ended by a few signatures in a forest lodge and a quiet flag ceremony nobody attended. The Soviet collapse was wild. But honestly, the story of how North and South Korea ended up as two completely different countries from the exact same people might be even crazier.